You're listening to the Immersive Audio Album Podcast.
Please listen with headphones for the best spatial experience. Hey everyone, I'm Jonathan, head of music at Immersive Audio Album, and I'm here with our lead developer, Cameron. So this is the fourth episode of the IAA podcast, and we want to thank all our listeners who've tuned into the previous episodes. And if you haven't already, be sure to check those out. So in previous episodes, we went over the history of immersive music and some of the more technical considerations that come with the format, like comparing listening with speakers versus listening with headphones. So I think the natural next topic is to discuss how our listeners can build their own setups and experience music in this format.
Yeah, I agree. Jonathan and I, we both have Atmos setups, but I wanted to ask, if you were to start from scratch, what would be your most ideal Atmos setup?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, I think the first thing I could say right off the bat is that a lot of people who don't like Atmos, one of their arguments is that setting up a system is too expensive for the average consumer. And maybe that was true at one point, but I think that's definitely not the case anymore. There's so many different options. I think it's kind of a blessing and a curse that because Atmos is such an adaptable format, there's so many different products you could buy, ranging from a single soundbar with, speakers that reflect in all directions all the way to a full, 714, 916 setup. So to kind of break it down from there, I think that there are these sort of different tiers of speaker-based setups. There's kind of what I would call the basic setup, which is very, DIY, and the idea would be you kind of scavenge for, older used bookshelf speakers and pair those up with an AVR. And if you're, comfortable, running things off a computer and running wires around the room, you can build something impressive for, a relatively low budget. And then kind of the opposite of that would be what I'd call the minimalist setup, which is, a very compact out-of-the-box system that doesn't take a lot of work to set up. And I think we're seeing a lot of investment in this area. Things like the Sonos Arc or the Sony Quad. These all-in-one systems that use a small number of wireless speakers to reproduce a full 714 system. And then from there, there's, kind of the traditional, home theater cinema setup with large, tower speakers. Or beyond that, the full audiophile setup with, expensive top-of-the-line gear. So I was thinking for this episode, we could kind of go through each of those scenarios and talk about, what the considerations are when it comes to setting up a system and what products we might recommend the audience look into.
Okay, yeah, that sounds great. Let's start with the basic setup. Say, I have some technical knowledge. I'm not afraid to look at manuals, maybe troubleshooting. I'm not afraid to run copper wires or run software through a computer. What's, the best budget setup that I could do that still sounds really good?
Yeah, so you could do kind of what I've recommended to, friends who were also kind of into the audio engineering technical side in the past, which is that, you could go on a secondhand site, like eBay or US Audio Mart and just pick up a bunch of, matched smaller bookshelf speakers. There are these brands like Paradigm, PSB, Polk. And, you could get, personally for my setup, I was able to get a pair of Paradigm Atoms around $40 a pair in used good condition. And then you could pair those up, with either a newer AVR that supports Atmos or an older one. And you could run all your music over an HDMI connection from a laptop into the AVR. Now, probably what you're thinking is like, how could you do Atmos with all bookshelf speakers? Because normally most diagrams show like ceiling mounted speakers or recessed in the ceiling. But I think there's no rule that says the height speakers actually have to be recessed in the ceiling. Not everybody is cutting holes in their ceiling to install Atmos speakers. Funny enough, I was just at a conference in Nashville centered around immersive audio, and there were some reps from Dolby who gave a breakout session talking about, outfitting a less ideal space for Atmos listening or mixing. And one of the solutions they mentioned is you could mount like a 2x4 sort of at the area where the wall meets the ceiling. And you could use that to mount like an angled speaker bracket. So you could have a full-size bookshelf speaker mounted in the ceiling. Alternatively, you could get like a tall bookshelf or like a high-mounted shelf and just point the bookshelf speakers down using that. Or, of course, they also make like speakers that are intended to be mounted on the wall, like the SVS prime elevation speakers or the Polk XT90s. So kind of all this is to say that I think it's a fallacy that you must have speakers recessed in the ceiling.
All right. That makes sense. Now, let's say that I'm someone who's not as comfortable with dealing with copper wire and running them through the walls, or maybe like pinning them on the walls. I don't want to feel like I'm in a Best Buy home theater demo room. I want a wife-approved setup. So tell me about like what your opinions are on kind of like this minimalist setup.
Well, I think this is probably where, most people's situation is. We're kind of the crazy ones, right? But like I was saying, in the intro there, I think the equipment manufacturers understand this, which is why we're seeing a lot of investment in this particular area. So there are a lot of these wireless systems. The most sort of basic version is a soundbar you put under your TV, and soundbars have existed for a while. The idea is like the left, center, and right channels are, in a single block that you can mount on the wall under your TV or like on a bookshelf. The new twist is they've added these upward firing speakers to them that will reflect sounds off the ceiling. And I think, like we're going to talk about later in the podcast, the degree to which this works is variable depending on the shape of your room and other kind of acoustic factors. But what's interesting to me is there's also systems where you could use the soundbar as the front channels, and then there are wireless speakers you could use as the rears or the sides. And in some cases, these wireless detachable surround speakers also have an upward firing module. So you have essentially 5 speakers on the ground, 3 in the soundbar, and 2 in the side or rear. And then these 3 detached things also have speakers that fire upward. So essentially you're getting a 5-1-4 system using only 3 wireless components that don't take up a lot of room. Now, the question you might be asking if you're someone who's used to the typical home theater setup is, how do I send the audio from whatever I'm listening with, whether it's an Apple TV or a Blu-ray player or some, HDMI device like an NVIDIA Shield I'm using to play my files from IAA? How do you direct the signal from what you're playing it off of to the speakers if you don't have an AVR in the middle? And what they've come up with is this process called HDMI ARC. So if you want to explain to the audience kind of how this system works.
Yeah, so HDMI ARC standing for audio return channel, is kind of like one way that manufacturers are trying to simplify the setup. So like traditionally, how you got your media to your sound system was that you would hook up your Blu-ray player or your game console or your streaming box to an AVR, and the AVR would handle all the audio and then send the video signal to your TV. So ARC kind of cuts out that AVR component like you're saying, and basically you would plug those devices straight into your TV, and then your TV will handle sending that data out a special port on HDMI called audio return channel, and that HDMI that goes to like a soundbar, for example, would that HDMI port will handle sending the audio to where it needs to go. So it kind of cuts that out. Now, there are two versions of ARC, and I know that can get confusing. So there's ARC, that's the older version, and then now there's eARC, and that's the newer version. So the older version of ARC can handle Dolby Atmos, but it only supports compressed audio formats. So for Dolby Atmos, this is going to be like the type of codec that you would get from a streaming service. Something like Dolby Digital Plus or something. Your Netflix is.
So this is fine if you're listening, like to Atmos using an Apple TV or, Tidal using a Fire Stick, something like that. You can use regular ARC.
Yeah, exactly. But the newer version of ARC has significantly more bandwidth to send more data through. And because of this increased bandwidth, you can get the full uncompressed version of Dolby Atmos signals out into the devices that support it. So that's the main difference between ARC and eARC, but both of them are designed to simplify your setup so that you don't have to have a large amplifier, and you could use one of these minimalist systems without, an extra big box you have to hide away, essentially.
Because, I think a lot of us, even people who weren't into audio originally, like I have memories when I was a kid, like we had a AVR and we had all these different devices connected to it. You had like the regular cable box. You had like whatever your game console was. Like I had a PlayStation 3. Then we had all these like, because my dad was into this stuff, we had all these like legacy devices. Like we had a VHS deck and like a Laserdisc player. And it would get pretty confusing because you'd have to remember like which input you assign the thing on the AVR. So I remember like when we want to watch a movie, it was like you'd go on the remote and you just keep pressing all the HDMI buttons until you found the thing that you had. So I think this is really good because it sort of takes all that, extra confusion out of the equation.
A nice thing is the latest HDMI standard supports something called CEC, which basically lets you send remote signals to various devices. This means that you only need one remote instead of 10 remotes to control all of the devices that you're talking about, which is such a big improvement because I remember my family members always asking me, which remote do I use to do this thing?
Oh, yeah.
And we had like 10 remotes on the table. It was, so it's much easier now. I'm very glad to see that go to the wayside now.
Yeah, we had like a, one of those little like bucket things you put all the remotes in.
Oh, and those remotes would eat AA batteries so quick.
And then you'd leave the batteries in for like a year and they get the battery acid and they would break the remote, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Jonathan, with all this in mind, do you still prefer a traditional AVR to like in one of these new minimalist systems with ARC or eARC? Like personally, I think for myself, it becomes a bit of an issue to route something like a gaming PC through a TV, but still get good audio with a nice monitor. Like all of the wiring decisions for that can get cumbersome because ARC wasn't designed to be used with like a PC. Now some monitors have ARC in them, but it's very, very few that have those. So what's your opinion on this?
It's a tough question. I think if you asked me like a year or two ago, I would have said like I'm kind of a purist and I'm used to the whole setup with the AVR where you run the copper wire for the speakers. And I still have a setup like that now. But, recently I have a neighbor who has a Sonos ARC with 2 detachable rear speakers. And yeah, I was pretty impressed by it. Like I went in very skeptical, thinking like it wasn't going to be able to match my 714. And it's not quite the same. I mean, particularly the height localization isn't quite the same effect as having 4 physical speakers above you. But it was impressive. And I think as long as you're listening with some kind of element behind you. So I'm not such a big fan of having just a single soundbar in front and relying on that to fill in both the rear and height element. But I think the soundbar in front and having rear speakers behind your couch, that is already better than what most people have heard, even if it's really just 5.1. So, personally, I'm a bit torn. like I was saying, I would have told you a year ago that for sure I would want an AVR and I'd want to wire up all my speakers and put them in the certified, Dolby locations to make a full 514, 714 system. But if I was starting from scratch and say like I had a roommate and I had less space, I would consider getting something like the Sony Quad or Sonos Arc.
Yeah, a lot of these new soundbar or wireless speaker systems simplify things to the point of not actually needing dedicated height speakers as well. So that can help in setups where you, for example, aren't allowed to drill into the wall. And I wanted to ask your opinion on this, though, specifically. So, as someone who has actual discrete dedicated ceiling speakers, what's your opinion on bouncing audio? Like, am I losing anything by using, even if I had like specific detached speakers that bounce audio off the ceiling from them? Am I losing anything versus having discrete speakers in the ceiling?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question because a lot of people think that like the main thing that Atmos adds over surround is the height element. Like when you walk up, if you walk up to someone on the street and you say Dolby Atmos, a lot of people say like, oh, that's surround with speakers that go in your ceiling. But that's not really what it is. As we've talked about in past episodes, the real innovation of Atmos is this object-based system where you can have it translate to different types of speaker arrays or even headphones. I mean, I can tell you there are some Atmos music mixes that don't even use the height speakers. I mean, I like when they're used, but it's not like a requirement of the system. So to answer your question, like, does using an up-firing speaker sound better or worse than actually having a speaker at the ceiling? It depends on how the mix was done. There are some music mixes where the height speakers are used kind of just to increase the size of the space, by putting like reverbs and delays up there, or by like lifting things slightly off the ground. Like you might hear like the snare drum hitting between the fronts and the front heights. So it sounds like it's a bit sort of bigger and in the room. And then there are other mixes where there are like discrete sounds in the top speakers, like a guitar solo or a backing vocal. When it comes to those kind of mixes where there are like distinct isolated sounds in those top channels, I find that with the up-firing speakers, it only really tends to be convincing if it's like a very bright, very percussive sound. Like a shaker overdub or like a guitar solo, like something very distinct and obvious. Because it's funny, like even with actual ceiling speakers, like sometimes it's kind of hard to tell what's coming from above you. When it comes to human hearing, the sort of weakest point for like perception is behind and above you. So a lot of times, like if there's things placed in those rear height speakers, even on my setup, like I can't always tell, like, is it coming from the rear? Is it coming from the rear height? So the answer is kind of, it varies. It could be convincing. It could not be convincing. But I don't think it's as much of a downgrade as having real height speakers as some people might tell you. Now, the thing for me, though, and this is like a whole other discussion, is that I like having like the real hi-fi setup. I have a cabinet where you could see all my gear. I have like all my dad's old like Silverface equipment from the 70s. I like having all that stuff on display, and I like being in the room with the speakers all around me. But I know most people are not like that. And especially if you're living in like a studio apartment, you don't want to feel like you're living in like the Best Buy Magnolia room.
Oh yeah. I'm totally like that. My setup is super clean. I've got almost no furniture and bamboo tables. So yeah, I don't want to see my speakers. So yeah, I guess the downside is the downside to having a wireless system versus an AVR is that like speakers last a really long time, especially if you can hook them up with copper wire. Like I still have KEF speakers from like 10 years ago, and they sound as great as they did the day I bought them.
Yeah, I've still got my dad's old Polk Monitor 10Bs that he bought in 1982. They still work perfectly.
Yeah, exactly. And when you buy one of these wireless systems, the software can become outdated or even become a security issue. So that's like another consideration as well to think about. And For example, another example is like my family bought Bose speakers back in the day, and they got outdated really, really quickly. We got HDMI going from 1.4 to 2.0 to 2.1. That all happened really, quickly. There's all these different formats and support, and we went from 1080 to 4K, and then now there's 4K 120 with VRR. There's so many different things that happen so quickly, and even though the speakers sounded okay, they can't really use them anymore, which is a shame. So, going back to our discussion topic, say, Jonathan, I wanted to make an all-out Atmos cinema. One question, though, I really have is that, like, how is Atmos in the home different from Atmos, like, in a cinema? Like, when you go to a theater. Like, my understanding was, like, when Brave came out, or when they were hyping up Atmos with the latest Lord of the Rings movies and stuff, that it had 32 speakers, something crazy like that. What's the difference? Like, do you need the 32 to get a full experience?
Yeah, I remember the first movie I saw in Atmos was in 2014, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes. I don't know if you remember when that came out. But there's this scene in the beginning where it takes place during like a thunderstorm and the rain comes out of the ceiling. And I remember being like totally amazed by that. But as I understand it, there is certainly a difference between like a near field home system, 512, 514, 714, versus these larger arrays they put into like Dolby cinemas where there could be, 32, 64, over 100 speakers. Now, interestingly, I did an interview with a Atmos mastering engineer a couple months ago who has experience dealing with both sides. And he told me one of the differences is that when you're mixing, you could tell the renderer software to go into something called array mode. And this essentially adds extra locations you could pan to beyond the typical 714. So in a home system, to my understanding, as far as you could go is 916. Like if you buy the most expensive AVR home theater processor, I believe there's a company called Anthem that makes one. It only goes up to 916. So what happens then when you go into array mode? It's like, well, instead of 916, which is front, wide, side, and rear, and then 6 heights, front heights, top, middles, and rear heights. There's like another set of side speakers that could go sort of between the wides and the fronts. So essentially you could keep adding speakers until like in every physical location you could pan, there's a speaker. Now the thing about this is like the kind of decisions that people make mixing music on a near field system may not necessarily work in a theater because the speakers are so far apart. So you think about like some of the mixes we've listened to, like a common thing is you might have like the main drums in the front and like say there's some kind of like overdub percussion that's layered on top of them, like a shaker or a cowbell or something. Imagine you're sitting in like an 100-seat theater and like all the drums are where the screen is. And then there's like just these loud like shakers going in the rear. I mean, for one thing, it would be overwhelming for the people sitting in the back. Like they'd be hearing all shaker and not enough anything else. But there could also actually be a time delay between the speakers that could mess up the way it's synced together. So those are just kind of some considerations that people would face mixing for both formats. But to my knowledge, there aren't really a lot of scenarios where a music mix would be played on a theater size array.
That's good to know. I always felt that, in the back of my head, saying like if I had unlimited funds, maybe I'm missing out by not having all 32 speakers, but that doesn't sound to be the case. So that's a good thing to know. So Jonathan, with all this in mind, just as a fun exercise, if you had unlimited funds and you could build a system from scratch, I assume you wouldn't use 32 speakers. How would you do it?
Well, that's a good question. I mean, my setup is kind of, when I moved here, I was still going to college, so it was very much on a budget, and I just kind of scavenged what I could from like secondhand parts and used my audio engineering knowledge to make something, that was sonically acceptable to me. But man, if I had unlimited money and I was starting from scratch, I would put like towers all around me. Like I'd get 7 like B&W Nautilus speakers and stick those all around me. And I would get like the most expensive AVR that decodes all the formats, not just Atmos, but also Oro 3D and even, MPEG-H Sony 360. And, I only have one sub in my apartment now, but, I've read on forums, there are people who have like systems that have, 7.4.4, so 4 subs, 1 at each corner. I'd go crazy with all that stuff.
I keep hearing you say like 7 point something. Why not go for more speakers, like the 9.2.4 or something like that? Do you think it's like diminishing returns, or like do you think it's because of like your room size perhaps? Like I know you have better stuff now, but like I don't think you have 9 in your array for the first number.
It's funny you ask that, because I have, the way my system is set up now, I have enough outputs. I have enough line outputs to set up 916. And the 0.6 like just isn't possible, because like the speaker would be blocking the window. Like I have this ugly speaker stand in front of my window, so that for cosmetic reasons I wouldn't do that. But I did set up the wide speakers just to see like what they did and if mixers were using them. And it is quite interesting. There are some mixes that don't use them at all, which is probably a sign that the mixer is using the bed for most of their panning and not objects. But like every once in a while, you'd come across a mix like the most recent Harry Styles album, Harry's House. Like on every song in that album, all the lead vocals are in the wide speakers and nowhere else. So it was kind of fun when I had it set up for 914, I would just cut off those speakers and you get like a karaoke mix of that particular record. But I think I ultimately found that because I'm in a smaller room, I didn't really feel like I was gaining anything by having those extra speakers between the fronts and the sides. So I've been happy with 714, but I know on forums some people swear by them, and certainly for a larger space, I think it would help to kind of fill in that gap in between the fronts and sides.
Yeah, I also think it's important that like when you're mixing or when you're listening to like listen to an array of different like formats, I think most people have like a certain amount of speakers that they have in their home, and like maybe tailoring towards some of these things versus some of the really niche things. Like for example, you're saying like people don't mix for 32 channel cinema. As cool as that would be. I mean,
not music. I guess on the film side, you kind of have to bear all these things in mind. Yeah.
Yeah. That seems really interesting. I would love to see if we can interview someone who does engineering for that, see how they balance sound effects versus a film score with 32 channels. I think that'd be a super interesting interview. If you guys know anyone, please reach out to us at immersiveaudioalbum.com in our contact. That'd be a great lead for us, and we would love to do an interview with someone who works in that field. But I think that I don't think it's a bad thing. And I think like it's nice to have different the ability to just toggle on and off like different sets of speakers. I think that's a really cool feature that you have to test like how it sounds on different things. And also you would also check it in spatials as well, like with headphones with binaural and stuff.
Yeah, I mean, this is what makes Atmos great. We talked about this in a prior episode, but with 5.1, it was either you were listening through 5 speakers or nothing. What's great about Atmos is it gives you all these possibilities. Say like someone's like you, they don't want speakers all over their room. They could get like a Sony quad system, or even something simpler like a single Era 300 in front of their TV. And if you're like an insane person like me and you want actual speakers above you, you could do that too. And this is what makes the format, such a game changer, and why I hope the audience for it will expand beyond what was there for 5.1. So on that note, let's take a short break, and afterwards we'll talk about some specific brands we'd recommend.
This podcast is sponsored by Immersive Audio Album, your #1 online hub for all things surround and immersive music. On our website, you'll find album and equipment reviews, interviews with industry professionals, and a whole lot more. In our online shop, you'll find a large catalog of high-res digital downloads in 5.1 surround sound, Dolby Atmos, and R3D. At IAA, we believe fans deserve to own their music in the highest quality possible.
Okay, so now we're coming back from the break. So one thing I thought would be interesting to talk about here is that I know, Cameron, you have more experience than me listening to a lot of these consumer home theater devices. So how do you rate the experience? And is there any particular product or particular brand you'd recommend listeners, either seek out or avoid? So I guess a better way to phrase the question is, if I walked into Best Buy tomorrow and I knew nothing about immersive audio and I wanted to build my first setup, what should be the first thing I look at?
Yeah, so I think we could start this discussion by talking about brands. Now, technology changes pretty quickly, so this is kind of in the context within the last few years, maybe a little bit of historical context. I think it's a good spot to talk about the most popular brand names. So I think the biggest one in the space currently is Samsung, especially because Samsung has been making a lot of acquisitions in the home theater audio space. For example, Samsung bought Denon and Marantz, which are very, very big AVR manufacturers. And those companies also owned a bunch of other companies prior to that acquisition, like Pioneer, for example. So Samsung is definitely a big player in the space. Samsung soundbars, very interesting. They have basically two distinct types of soundbars. So they have the ultra slim soundbars for your ultra minimalist type of person. They've got these really long 3-inch wide, 1-inch tall soundbars, very small, that are paired with a sub. And they have all the arrays to do all the bouncing. And the soundbar alone can sound a little bit tinny due to the nature. You can't beat physics when you go that small. But together with the sub, they sound pretty good. And Samsung, like I said, they have an array. If you want to go really high end, Samsung can accommodate you on that. I'd say that Samsung it can be a safe bet. They have lots of flexibility in what you would want to do. I think the best way is to maybe pick out a few of the different Samsungs, go to one of those Magnolia showrooms and take a listen to those. And they're really good, like I said, for the person that wants just kind of a really normal setup. And the Samsung is also really good because they have a very large array of budget ranges. They can accommodate cheaper and more expensive.
So what about another big brand like Sony? Something we've talked about frequently, and you were the first to tell me about it, was the Sony Quad, which is not quite a soundbar. It's kind of these 4 detachable pieces that you could place around the room. So it's more akin to an old school 70s quad setup. So how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so Sony is making some big waves in this space. I've heard a lot of praise for Sony's discrete wireless system. So basically, Sony has made a couple of different ones. They have the HTA A5, A7, A9, and now the quads. And as you were describing, they are a set of individual discrete speakers. So the quads have 4. I think most of them have 4, maybe sometimes 5, most likely 4. And they're discrete. So you've got a full left, a full right. They're not in one soundbar, so you can make good separation. And each one of them also has height speakers that bounce. So the praise comes from the fact that they are discrete. They are their own self-contained dedicated unit. They're not a pain. There's to set up. The connections are good between everything. They support the most modern standards like eARC, things like that, and they sound really good. And I think that has to do with the size of the unit that they decided on. They didn't go too small. I think it can be an issue when you're trying to make minimalist stuff. And they went for large, flat, almost like a small painting canvas, as opposed to as small as possible.
I thought they look kind of like acoustic panels to me.
Yes, they do look like acoustic panels. They're very clean. They're very nice,
yes.
Especially the quads. But if you want to save some money, you can go with one generation older, the A9s, and they're like cylinders. They kind of look like Bluetooth speakers, and they're very easy to put wherever. The magic of the Sony system is that the calibration's really good. Similar to Sonos, similar to some of these other AVRs with the mics and stuff. They'll play noises to calibrate for your room, and their calibration's really good. And overall, it's just a really nice, balanced sounding system.
Yeah, one of the things I like about it I mean, I haven't heard one yet, but a common complaint people have about soundbars is that the front stage is very narrow because you're cramming the left, center, right into one block. But the Sony Quads, you could spread them pretty far apart. And I guess it does the center as like a phantom center.
Yeah, the centers are phantom centers. Now, if you want the best setup with the Sony Quad, they recommend pairing it with one of the Sony TVs, like a Bravia. And where the Bravia has really good TV speakers, most TV speakers that are inbuilt sound really bad. But Sony has a technology where they're sending the sound through the glass in the OLED panel so that the TV itself is the entire TV is your center, and they actually do sound good. So, and that's in contrast to a lot of like manufacturers that use like a tiny 5 or 10 watt speaker that like bounces on the bottom to your wall and back, which sounds bad. Sony does a good job at that, but unfortunately, the best setup I think with those is with the Sony TV.
That would be fun to test with one of those like Atmos mixes where it has the vocals in the center and nothing else. So I guess if you muted all the Sony Quad speakers and you just had the TV going, you'd hear the lead vocal and nothing else. That would be kind of funny. Yeah.
Just unplug them from the wall.
Yeah.
Yeah. So as I was alluding to, this is in contrast to something like a Bose system. Bose gets a lot of bad rap, and Bose is an interesting company. So they had a big reputation. I think you said like the 901s were like their biggest thing. And those are quite big speakers. Like they were.
Yeah, my dad used to tell me in the 80s, like the 901s were like high-end speakers. And even if you go to like a used record store or used equipment store, like they tend to be expensive. Like if you go on eBay right now, say an old pair of 901s is like $1,000.
Yeah.
So, yeah. And
I think the executives sat down and said, like, what's the reason that more people don't have these in their homes? And the big reason is like, oh, they're too big. There are a number of people that just they can't fit it. It's kind of an eyesore. What do you like? You can't put them away, things like that. So Bose had a really big focus on miniaturization of speakers, and they put a lot of R&D development into that. And I think it really shows in some of their latest products. For example, their noise-canceling headphones are super popular. And another thing that was really interesting is Bose has glasses that you can wear that have really good speakers for how small they are. And this is something that kind of bleeds into our previous discussion on AR, VR. But Bose has partnered with some of these companies that are making AR glasses with screens in them and stuff. And they have a good foot forward in that area. I think they were too early, and I think they made their speakers too small. Because ultimately, in the end of the day, it is hard to beat physics. It works in the glasses and it works in headphones because the speakers are so close to you. But when you're making a home theater setup, I think that the jewel cubes that they made are just too small. And I think that's one big drawback to them. Like, you can get better sounding speakers for cheaper if you just go a little bit bigger. And because of all the R&D effort that they put into that, I think they were one of the first ones that had wireless rears. They were just really expensive, and they were a hard deal to swallow, I think, at the time, because they were so early into the space. I think now it's a kind of a different landscape. A lot of people are more used to that type of size, or they want that type of size. But I think at the time it was hard because a lot of the home theater was sounded better.
So that's interesting. I wasn't really thinking about Bose in this particular context, but going back to like some other big name brands, what do you think about LG?
I think LG, they're known for their TVs. Like, LG makes great OLED TVs and things like that.
They were the ones who invented OLED, right?
I think they're I'm not sure if they invented it per se, but I know that they have they're pushing the industry forward, like their new WOLED technology, the tandem OLED panels that are in the newest iPads, for example. And they even have like a new version of OLED that's supposed to be extremely burn-in resistant. That they changed like the emission phosphors to make them last longer and things like that. But LG is a good TV manufacturer. In terms of their soundbars, though, I think they're a little bit all over the road. I mean, their soundbars are going to sound better than the speakers you get in their TVs. But I don't think they're going to be that top-level experience. I haven't heard a particular soundbar from LG that blew me away. And if LG would like to send us one, maybe we can change our opinion on that. But I haven't found one.
Please do.
Yeah. And that kind of makes me think of some other brands too. So another brand that I find very interesting in the space is Yamaha. Yamaha is known for, I think in my world at least, instruments. You know, you've got electric pianos and electric violins and things like that. So like they know how to work with audio.
They make guitars too, right?
Yeah, they make guitars.
Acoustic guitar, yeah.
Yeah, they do a lot of things. So for that, and they make AVRs, and their AVRs are really nice. They have a really great calibration system. They have some interesting, unique music EQ stuff that I feel like I don't find a lot anymore. It kind of reminds me back of that crystallizer age.
Yeah, they have like a custom up mixer, and they've probably modified this now for Atmos. But I had an old 7.1, a vintage series Yamaha, and it had like a button you could press to turn stereo into 7.1. And it was at least as effective as like whatever the Dolby codec was. That was like PL2X or PL2Z, one of those, something in that area. Yeah.
Yeah, I really liked my Yamaha AVR. I think that if you are a purist and you don't want a Samsung owned AVR like Denon and Marantz, not that they've been acquired, Yamaha's a really good alternative to that, and I would listen to those. I haven't heard too much of their soundbars. I imagine that their soundbars are also similar to LG soundbars. But in terms of AVR, I think their AVR is definitely something to consider. I wanted to ask you, Jonathan, say that you didn't know that Denon and Marantz were acquired by Samsung. What do you think about their AVRs? Because I know that they have a really good reputation in the community.
Well, my first Atmos receiver, when I first upgraded, was a Denon S750, which is 512. And that was an upgrade from before that. I had an Onkyo 7.1. I forgot what the model number was. I thought the Denon was better than the Onkyo, but I think aren't they really like the same brand? It's probably just like the same parts with like a nicer GUI or something. But I always thought, like growing up, I thought Marantz was like the cream of the crop. And in my, my vintage quad system, I have an old Marantz 4070, which is like this beautiful piece of, silver face gear. It has all those like nice sliders and things. I think that version of Marantz, where, as I understand it, they made stuff like in the US during the 70s, that doesn't really exist anymore. But
that's a shame.
If you go into a Magnolia room, like usually the Marantz AVR is the most expensive one that they carry in those particular rooms.
I think what appealed to me about Denon and Marantz, I think Marantz especially, is that their AVRs are thinner than some of the other ones. Like, I think if you picture an AVR, it's like this big bulky box. But
yeah,
they've got some slimline ones that look really nice and that I feel like are easier to fit into some of these like lower TV stands that you could put into like one of the shelves there.
The Marantz ones have like a very particular look. Like they have a circular display. If you've seen them, usually most AVRs, they have like a square thing where it'll say, the input and whatever codec you're getting. The Marantz ones are a lot slimmer in that regard, more streamlined. Now, I wanted to ask you, because we talked about them a lot in the last episode and a little bit you alluded to in this one. Is like Creative doing anything with Atmos nowadays? Is that even still like a functioning brand?
Creative had some interesting things, like they had the SX Air, which is like a head tracking binaural type of thing. But like I feel like Creative hasn't really put out anything in that space. I think the only thing that I know that has a good reputation from Creative currently is their the Pebble speakers, which are just like really nice desktop. Well, they're not really nice. They're basic, good value desktop speakers that don't sound bad. The Creative Pebble speakers. But aside from that, I haven't really heard or I haven't really gotten excited about any of the gear that they've been releasing.
So the days of the Sound Blaster are over.
I think a lot of the PC stuff, like a lot of that sound gear has been rolled directly into the motherboard. So maybe they have some drivers or software that are inbuilt, but most people don't really associate it with Creative specifically anymore.
How about like a brand that I have never owned any equipment by them, but I know they're doing some stuff with Atmos. How about JBL?
JBL, I feel like, is a really, really interesting company. They have a lot of really niche experimental idea. They remind me of LG with phones. LG had that Wing phone that like you would flip the screen like a sidekick, and it'd be like a T-shaped phone with like it got like 2 screens in it. They were doing all sorts of it. They were putting wood on phones. LG, like, I feel like JBL's the equivalent experimental people that did that. So JBL has this pair of binaural headphones that are super cool, that like let you tune like all of the parameters like to get like your binaural perfectly. I think it's discontinued now, unfortunately, but they do experimentation like that. JBL also has sound bars with detachable components. Like you have one sound bar and you can detach the rears, and they're wireless. You could bring them with you as Bluetooth speakers. Like they're very experimental.
I like the idea of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
you
cool.
can, if they're wireless, why not just take them with you? They're already battery powered. Like it's interesting. Or maybe you want to go camping and still have like a home theater setup. They had some interesting stuff like that. So JBL's like, I would say they're niche. They're kind of like a fun brand on the experimental space. They've got some interesting ideas there. Unfortunately, I don't think they're as popular. And that could be just due to execution. Experimental things, hard to write the software properly for all of that. But I appreciate them for trying new things, because I feel like there's a lot of that doesn't happen anymore.
On the professional side, I know they make like well-regarded studio monitors. Like I have a friend with a Atmos setup, and he's using JBL's like for all 714 channels. And he seems to like those. And I think they're certainly more affordable on the consumer side than these, brands like, Genelec or PMC, where a full array could cost you like 10 grand or something crazy.
Speaking of a 10 grand array, I saw on IAA's editorial you've recently reviewed the Airsound system, which is a super awesome, expensive, immersive speaker. That's, I would say, is a little niche, but what did you think about those?
Yes, and I also saw it. It was being demoed live at the Nashville Mix event this last weekend, and I talked to the 2 guys who founded the company, Guy and Dan Fletcher. But they sent me a system a couple months ago, and they were very nice, and they let me keep it for a while and run all these crazy tests with it and compare stuff. So yeah, like you said, you could read my article, sort of summing up my thoughts about it in the IA editorial section. But the Airsound system is interesting. It's a custom-built speaker that essentially has, each one of these speakers has 5 drivers. There's 1 in the center, 2 in the side, and 2 on top. And they're run by software that runs on your computer. And you could use up to 4 of them, and you can place them anywhere in the room. And as long as you tell the software where they are, it will reconstruct the Atmos sound fields based on, whatever is available to it. And I directly compared a 4-speaker system. So this is kind of like a diamond shape with 1 speaker in front, 1 in the back, and 2 in the side. And it generates 714 from that. And it was pretty impressive. I mean, like I was talking about before, the height localization varies on acoustic factors like the size and shape of your room. Obviously, with like a cathedral ceiling, like those kind of systems that bounce things off the ceiling aren't going to work. But I listened to a bunch of my favorite mixes where, like I know that there are discrete elements coming out of the top speakers, and it was pretty convincing. And like you were saying, this is kind of a niche product at the moment. They're angling it more towards like mixing studios. Like say you have a nice control room and you don't want to buy more monitors and drill holes in the ceiling. You could just set up these 4 speakers all around, and once you do the necessary calibration, you're all set up to mix in Atmos.
I think the concept of PC monitors are interesting. As someone who plays more video games than listens to music, there's some interesting other niche brands. I think Kanto is making like really decent, appropriately sized speakers that are good for PC. I think also there's Bluesound that has been making PC speakers. That's kind of a newer brand that is an interesting one, and I'm excited to see what they come out with. But I don't necessarily think they're directly in the Atmos space. So with that, let's move away from these niche brands to the high-end brands. I think you have more experience with Polk Audio than I do. You want to talk about Polk?
Well, like I was saying, I have my dad's old Monitor 10Bs from the early 80s that he had in his first apartment, and they still work. and they've survived. They were in the attic for like 20 years, and they were in our utility room when it flooded a few times, and they still work perfectly through all that. So I love those speakers.
I had a couple of their things, and my one of my friends has a full Polk home theater system as well, and they sound really nice. I really like some of the finishes they have on their wood, and like they're just they're more of a classic looking brand than some of these new like metal and aluminum based like minimalist. Yeah.
I love like all the retro stuff, like these Polk speakers. They have like the rosewood finish.
Yeah, they got like the big towers, and like they're fun in a different sense. But yeah, Polk makes nice stuff. They have consistent quality, I would say, as well.
To tie it back to like the whole Atmos thing, they make these interesting little, like, I guess you could call them bookshelf speakers. The model number is XT90. They're like these wedge-shaped speakers that could be used either as up-firing. So they're kind of shaped like they're sort of like a isosceles triangle, And so you could mount it, you could put it on top of your speaker, and it'll shoot upward.
Oh, they're like an attachment.
Yes, or you can mount it on the wall, and it'll point down at you. So it's kind of like a multi-purpose, either wall mount or up-firing. There's another company called SVS that makes a speaker like this. They call it the prime elevation speaker. It's kind of an interesting concept, like a multi-purpose speaker you could flip over. So you could either hang it on the wall like a picture frame, or you can put it on top of your monitor speaker and have it fire upward.
That is interesting. Nice to see some experimentation in that. I hope that takes off, though. It does sound like a neat way to do it without drilling a hole in your ceiling, as you were saying earlier. I want to talk about Sonos.
Yes.
I think Sonos is like this big brand that has a lot of things behind it, and they've kind of faltered a little bit lately. I think
really?
People are not happy with their app. Yeah, Sonos released noise canceling headphones. They're very expensive. I think they're near the price of the AirPod Max. And on the release of their headphones, they changed their app software. And unfortunately, the new app has some issues with intermittent connectivity. They've dropped some functionality that made it harder to use, and the app is a little glitchy and unreliable, which is unlike Sonos. Sonos was known for being this rock solid system, which is unfortunate because the Sonos stuff sounds really nice.
Like I was telling you, I heard the eARC with rear speakers, and I thought that was great. And like just about every mixing engineer I've reviewed will say they have like an Era 300. They check their mixes on just like a single one to see what it does to kind of fill the room. So I feel like they were like the professionally endorsed brand. But like it's like, yeah, so I'm surprised to hear you say that.
Yeah. And they had some interesting stuff too. Like IKEA had Sonos speakers in their symphonic line that looked like furniture, and I thought that was a really neat way of like hiding speakers, similar to the Sony Quad where they're on the minimalist side. Like that was a nice way of getting rear speakers in, or adding more speakers to your system. But I think right now I'm not 100% sure I could recommend them due to the reputation of the app, but they are what I would consider a high-end brand due to the cost of their speakers. Another brand I wanted to talk about that I've had a bad experience with is Bang & Olufsen. So Bang & Olufsen makes a lot of really gorgeous speakers. I cannot fault them on their design. Their design is beautiful. They use wood and cloth and all of these things. The problem I have with them is that even when you wire them in with an AUX cable, like a 3.5 millimeter cable, they have audio delay, and that's a shame. I think they're doing a lot of processing to make their speakers sound perhaps better for their size and things like that. But the fact that you can't wire them in and not have audio delay is an issue. And one other issue is that like the best way to not have audio delay is to go through AirPlay, which means the best way to listen to the speaker array in a surround sound environment is to connect them via an Apple TV. And I feel like at that point, you might as well just use HomePods.
Yeah, so that I was going to ask you, that's because that's a perfect segue. We talk about Apple as kind of like more of the software side as a player in that area, because obviously Apple Music is the primary way a lot of people are listening to Atmos music. But like, what is Apple really offering like on the hardware side? So as I understand it, you can use 2 HomePods like to play in Atmos. Yeah.
Let's give some context first. There are 2 types of HomePods. There's the HomePod Mini, which are little small spherical things, and then there's the big HomePod, and there's 2 versions of that. The big ones support a stereo pairing, but when you use them in a stereo pair, you can use them in kind of like this virtualized spatial audio mode that does reflections. They have a 360-degree thing. And it's very interesting because Apple, I feel like, is trying to push the spatial audio thing a lot. And one of the ways to do that is to have 2 of the big HomePods. You can do it with 2 of the small ones. Their AirPlay is really good. I have an Apple TV, and I don't notice any latency between them and my HomePods. Like, they sound really good, and they sound really good for their size. And I think, like, if you want a home theater speaker system that is subtle, even HomePod Minis would sound better than your TV.
So my question for them would be, like, why is it limited to 2? Like, why can't I just, like, stick 4 HomePods in the corners of my room, like the Sony Quad?
Knowing software and things like wireless interference and things like that, maybe they weren't confident that it could support more than those 2. Like, they're sending a lot of data, and they're trying to have it be nearly instant, right? But, like, oh my god, if they were able to make the 2 HomePods in the front and 2 HomePod Minis in the back, and have it be spatial audio, like with HomePod Minis, I would love that. I really, really wish Apple could figure out a way to do that. I'm not 100% sure due to bandwidth limitations. Maybe with Wi-Fi 7 they could do something like that. But for now, it is on my wish list. But I will say that they do sound nice. They do sound pretty good for what you're getting. Apple TV and 2 HomePod Minis is decent if you compared to like a cheaper budget soundbar.
Yeah, very cool. So how about, like, as the sort of the last piece of this, like, we get into some like budget brands. Like, I remember when this was before Atmos, when my brother moved into his first apartment, he had like a basic like Vizio soundbar that had rear speakers in the back, kind of like the like Bose Jewels, like you're talking about, like that size. And I would assume Vizio are doing something with Atmos. They have to be.
So one of my friends actually worked at Vizio, and they did a lot to try to make their soundbars as good as possible for the budget and the size that they were. So I would say, like, in terms of budget brands, Vizio has a good rep, and if you wanted something on the lower cost side, that'd be one brand to look into. I would say that Vizio sounds better than Element, which is, I think, kind of like a Target brand type of thing. I think they sound better than what TCL and Hisense make on the lower end as well. One thing of note, though, is that Vizio was acquired by Walmart, and my friend who used to work there, who no longer works there, I don't know if they've changed anything, so I can't attest to their quality because I don't really listen to budget home theater stuff anymore. So I know they have a good rep, but I couldn't really say how they are now, unfortunately.
Man, is there like any audio manufacturer left that hasn't been swallowed up by some conglomerate? It's crazy.
Yeah, I've been noticing this a lot lately, of the consolidation of a lot of these different brands. So I think we are starting to see like new competitors in the space. I talked about like Bluesound and Kanto and how they're making their own stuff. And I think as time goes on, they might have better stuff in the future, which is exciting. But yeah, it's a shame to have some of these brands get swallowed up, and I hope they're not reducing quality, but I can't really say if they are or not. That leads me to thinking about some of these legacy brands. You've got Klipsch, Kef, and Bauer Wilkins. Those are like big high-end brands as well. I love my Kef speakers. So a lot of people don't know these exist. The Kef T-series speakers are thin, flat speakers that are discrete and connect with copper wire. And they're very, very nice. And for how small they are, they sound very good. I do still think they need a good sub, but they also have a matching sub that looks really nice. So if you're looking for a discrete copper wire system that connects to an AVR that might be Wi-Fi approved, I would look into the Kef T-series speakers.
You heard it first here. Well, so kind of to tie a bow on all this, I guess my last question would be kind of like a interesting hypothetical. So if you could kind of design in your mind, and this doesn't have to be, it could be totally unrealistic, like a sort of fantasy product to deliver, a fantasy hardware product to deliver immersive audio. So like mine would be like, what if there was like wallpaper you could put on your wall that has like speaker terminals in it, or like a big like poster size rigid thing you could just mount on your wall that has speakers in it, and then there was some software in like either in your AVR or in a computer app where you could just tell it, I have these things hanging on the wall, just use them to play Atmos music.
That's such an interesting idea. I imagine you could do it the same way Sony does it with their Bravia TVs, where you're just vibrating the glass and using that as a transducer, or like electrostatic or something like that. That'd be really interesting.
Yeah, maybe somebody's working on it. I don't know.
My dream immersive audio or audio gear that I would love to have is I would love to have VESA compatible rear projecting monitor speakers. A lot of monitors, inbuilt speakers for things like PC gaming or even like studio work and stuff, sounds really, really bad. They've got like 5-watt speakers and they're tinny and they don't get that loud. And, I don't like having, I'm a minimalist, I don't like having discrete monitors on my table, although I do have to have something that sounds better than that, so I do. But I wish I didn't have to. And I know that you don't have to because I have a studio display that does 7.1. And the studio display speakers sound so much better than, I want to say like 99% of the monitors I've ever used in my life. If someone could make that in a way that maybe like there's a stand included that helps power them, but like in a way where like you're attaching a monitor to a stand or an arm, and it has on the rear of it just like an array that bounces audio like off the wall and back towards the front or something like that, that just replaces the monitor speaker in a way that's subtle, maybe something that fits a 27-inch monitor, because I feel like 24 might be hard to do. I think you could do it in a 27, certainly a 32. So I don't have to put like a soundbar on my table or big monitors on my table, something that is just really hidden out of the way, extremely minimalist. I would love something like that. I think another great idea though would be, we talked about how like a lot of these wireless speakers get software support that drops, and you've got these speakers that do work, but then you can't use them for anything. You can't pair them with a new brand or this or that. I would love to see kind of like a more open standard calibration system that allows you to mix and match different brands of wireless speakers. Say I could have the Sony quads mixed with like a Sonos bar in the front or something like that. I think that'd be really, really awesome if something could happen like that. I know there was this standard called WISA. It was like the wireless spatial audio standard. I know my LG TV has this built in. And it tried to do something like that, where you could pair rears to a TV and it could be a different brand. They didn't have to be LG branded or something like that. But I don't think it really took off, because every time I looked for a WISA speaker, they were really hard to find. And I think now they're more available, but it's been so long since this came out that people have kind of forgotten that it exists. So that's a shame.
So what you're describing is sort of like an open source protocol where, like, say you could run some calibration thing on your computer and it'll say like, well, I have, 2 Sony quads, I have 2 HomePods, and I have like a Sony TV. And you could just use that as like your 5.1 system.
Yeah, that'd be great.
Yeah, I think that's brilliant. And as it so happens, it sounds like Dolby is working on something kind of like this.
Oh, no way.
At CES, I haven't heard a demo of this, but I read about it. They're demoing this technology they call FlexConnect. And the idea of it is like what you were saying. You could gather a bunch of wireless speakers which aren't necessarily matched and put them anywhere in the room, kind of like Airsound. And when you run the software, it'll understand like, oh, I have this speaker, on the side, and I have one in the front, and it'll use what's available to it to reconstruct an Atmos soundstage. So I don't know like what their plans are for this. I don't know like if there's a specific rollout date. I don't know if it'll be like WISA, where you'll have to buy specifically branded wireless speakers that have this protocol built into them. But it's an exciting development for sure.
Yeah, I think any level of future proofing with audio gear like is something that I'm looking forward to because like I said, my old speakers with copper wire, they'll work for a decade or more, multiple decades, no problem. So it would be nice to be a little bit more sustainable with some of this new audio equipment that we're getting.
But like I just know from experience that like in most households there are like a bunch of wireless speakers sitting around that aren't doing anything. Everybody's got like a Beats pill that probably someone bought them for Christmas or on Black Friday that they don't use anymore. Maybe they have like an Alexa speaker. It would be great if like imagine you wanted to listen to Atmos and you could use stuff you already have in your house instead of just having to go out and buy more equipment. I mean, that would be the dream, I think.
Yeah, that'd be really a nice way for people to get into Atmos without having to worry so much. Maybe they only need one source device or something compatible. But we'll see what Dolby does with their Atmos FlexConnect, and when they have more information about it, we'll probably have an article on immersiveaudioalbum.com.
If they want to like give us a demo of it at some point, we'd be fine with that.
Yeah, I would love to hear it too.
All right, well, I think that's a good spot to end it. So thanks for tuning in, everybody, and come back next month for our next episode.